What would you do if you stumbled upon 4 helpless bear cubs abandoned in a drainage ditch during the worst ice storm of the decade? No mother in sight, no warmth to keep their tiny bodies alive, just the haunting sound of their desperate cries echoing through the frozen wilderness. Robert and Sarah Peterson faced this heart-wrenching dilemma, but the real question wasn't just about saving these innocent lives. It was about why someone would separate cubs from their mother during hibernation season and whether these tiny bears could survive the night's plummeting temperatures. Don't forget to subscribe to witness the incredible journey of these 4 bear cubs fighting against all odds for survival. The January wind howled through Montana's Bitterroot Valley like a wounded animal, driving sheets of freezing rain against the windshield of Robert's old Ford pickup. His wetted hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as another gust threatened to push them off the narrow mountain road. Beside him, Sarah peered through the passenger window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched ice crystals form in real time. "Robert," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm, "slow down. Something's not right." She pressed her hand against the window, squinting through the darkness at something in the roadside ditch. Robert eased his foot off the accelerator, decades of forest ranger instincts kicking in. The pickup's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating what looked like dark shapes huddled against a concrete drainage pipe. His heart skipped a beat. In 35 years of wildlife service, he'd never seen anything quite like this. "Dear Lord," Sarah gasped, already reaching for her heavy-duty flashlight. "Robert, those look like cubs." The truck hadn't fully stopped before Sarah was fumbling with her seat belt, her hands trembling not from the cold but from the urgency of what lay ahead. Robert killed the engine, and the full force of the storm hit them as they stepped out. The freezing rain felt like needles against their exposed skin, but neither of them hesitated. Their boots crunched on the ice-covered gravel as they approached the drainage pipe. Sarah's flashlight beam revealed what they both feared: 4 tiny black bear cubs, no more than a few weeks old, huddled together in a shivering mass of wet fur. Their eyes, barely open, reflected the flashlight's beam with a desperate gleam. "They should be denning with their mother," Robert muttered, his jaw clenched tight against both the cold and his rising anger. "Someone must have found their den, and—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The implications were too disturbing. Sarah knelt beside the cubs, her heart breaking as the smallest one lifted its head and let out a weak cry. "They're soaked to the bone, Robert." The little ones barely moving, her voice cracked as she ran her flashlight over each cub, assessing their condition. "They won't last another hour in this weather." Robert scanned the area, looking for any sign of the mother bear, but the storm had turned the world into a white blur beyond their immediate vicinity. The wind carried no sound of an adult bear, no protective growl that should have greeted their presence, just the plaintive whimpers of 4 orphaned cubs and the relentless drum of freezing rain. "We can't leave them," Sarah said, already shrugging off her coat. The smallest cub, its fur matted against its tiny body, had stopped shivering, a dangerous sign. The wildlife center's 2 hours away, and in this storm. Robert nodded grimly, already knowing what they had to do. "Our cabin's 15 minutes from here. We'll have to risk it." He helped Sarah gather the cubs, each one barely the size of a house cat, their bodies terrifyingly cold against their hands. The largest cub weakly tried to crawl away, a spark of wild instinct still burning despite its desperate condition. Sarah gently scooped it up, cradling it close to her chest. "Shoo, little one," she whispered, her voice catching. "We're trying to help you." As they carefully transferred the cubs to the truck's cab, Robert's ranger training warred with his humanity. Taking in wild animals, especially bears, went against everything he had learned, but leaving them meant certain death. And something about the situation felt wrong. Bears didn't abandon their cubs, and these were far too young to be away from their mother. Sarah climbed into the back seat, arranging the cubs in her lap and wrapping them in emergency blankets from their ranger kit. The smallest one hadn't moved since they picked it up, but she could feel its heart beating weakly against her palm. Robert turned the key, and the truck roared to life as he carefully maneuvered back onto the treacherous road. Sarah's voice cut through the storm's howl. "Robert, what kind of person would do this? Who would take cubs from their mother in the middle of winter?" He met her eyes in the rearview mirror, seeing the same mix of compassion and determination that had made him fall in love with her 40 years ago. "I don't know, Sarah, but right now these little ones need us. Everything else can wait." The truck pushed forward through the worsening storm, carrying its precious cargo toward the only chance these cubs had for survival. But as the smallest cub's breathing grew more labored, Sarah couldn't help but wonder if they'd already run out of time. The storm intensified, turning the 15-minute drive into a harrowing test of Robert's driving skills. Through it all, the cubs huddled closer to Sarah, their wild instincts overwhelmed by their desperate need for warmth and comfort. As their cabin's porch light finally pierced the darkness ahead, Sarah looked down at the tiny faces and whispered, "Hold on, little ones. Just hold on." The old truck's headlights cut a path through the swirling ice as Robert navigated the final stretch to their cabin. In his 40 years of mountain driving, he never felt such urgency pressing down on his shoulders. Beside him, Sarah cradled the 4 bear cubs, her body heat the only thing standing between them and the freezing grip of hypothermia. The smallest one was barely breathing. "Robert," Sarah's voice cracked as she pressed her ear against the tiny cub's chest. Its wet fur had begun to freeze, creating tiny icicles that broke her heart. The other 3 cubs pressed closer to their littermate, their instincts still strong enough to know something was terribly wrong. Robert pulled up as close to the cabin's front porch as possible, the truck's tires crunching over ice-covered gravel. "I'll get the mudroom ready," he said, already pushing through the storm. "It's the warmest space we've got." The wind howled like a wounded creature as Sarah carefully gathered the cubs in her arms. The largest one, its dark eyes reflecting a hint of wilderness despite its weakened state, let out a soft whimper. "It's okay, buddy," she whispered, the name coming naturally as she looked into those eyes. "We're going to help you." Inside, Robert had already transformed their mudroom into a makeshift medical station. Their old electric heater hummed in the corner, and he'd laid out every towel they owned on the wooden bench. 35 years of forest service had taught them both to be prepared, but nothing had prepared them for this. "Get those heating pads from the first aid kit," Robert instructed, his ranger training taking over as he helped Sarah place the cubs on the towels. "We need to warm them gradually. Too fast could shock their systems." Sarah worked quickly, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite their trembling. As she dried each cub, their unique personalities began to emerge. The largest one, Buddy, remained protective, trying to position himself between his siblings and these strange humans. The second largest, whom Sarah had started calling Charlie, showed a gentler nature, accepting their help with trusting eyes. The third cub, Rocky, lived up to his name by fighting against their attempts to dry him, showing a spark of defiance that gave them hope. But it was Scout, the smallest one, who worried them most. His tiny body felt lifeless under Sarah's careful hands. "Come on, little Scout," Sarah pleaded, gently rubbing his chest. "Don't give up on us now. Robert watched his wife work, remembering countless other rescues over their years of service. But this felt different, personal. The storm raged outside as they fought their own battle within. Minutes stretched into hours as they monitored temperatures, administered small amounts of warm fluid with eyedroppers, and prayed for signs of improvement. Rocky and Charlie had begun to show more alertness, their eyes tracking movement and their cries growing stronger. Buddy remained vigilant but had accepted their presence enough to take fluids. Scout, however, barely moved. "I've got Dr. Martinez on the satellite phone," Robert announced, returning from checking their emergency communications. "The roads are completely iced over. She can't get here until morning at the earliest." He knelt beside Sarah, who hadn't left Scout's side. "She says we're doing everything right. Just keep them warm and hydrated." Sarah nodded, her eyes never leaving the tiny cub. "Look at their paws, Robert," she said softly. "They're too young to be away from their mother. They should still be denning." Her voice hardened. "Someone did this deliberately." Robert's jaw tightened as he examined the cubs more closely. Their claws were clean and unworn. They hadn't walked here on their own. No tracks led to or from the drainage pipe where they'd found them. Someone had placed them there, separated them from their mother during the most vulnerable time of their lives. "The wildlife authorities need to know about this," he said, his ranger instincts kicking in. "Bears don't abandon their cubs, especially not during hibernation." "This is..." A sudden movement caught their attention. Scout, the tiny fighter, had lifted his head and let out a weak but distinct cry. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes as the little cub struggled to move toward his siblings. "That's it, Scout," Robert encouraged, helping the cub nestle between Buddy and Charlie. "You've got more fight in you than we thought." Rocky completed the circle, all four cubs now huddled together, their breathing stronger and more regular. The night crept forward, marked by regular temperature checks and careful feeding sessions. Sarah and Robert took turns monitoring the cubs, neither willing to leave them alone for long. As the storm's fury began to ease, replaced by the soft pad of melting ice against the windows, they allowed themselves to hope. "Remember our first bear rescue?" Sarah asked, breaking the pre-dawn silence. "That mother with the injured paw?" Robert smiled, reaching for her hand. "How could I forget? You insisted on climbing that ravine in the dark to check on her cubs. These little ones," Sarah gestured to the sleeping bears. "They remind me of why we never retired from ranger service. Every life matters." The first rays of sunrise were beginning to pierce the storm clouds when they heard a vehicle approaching. Dr. Martinez had made it through, bringing with her years of wildlife veterinary experience and, more importantly, hope for the cubs' future. But as Robert went to greet her, he and Sarah shared a look that spoke volumes. These weren't just another rescue anymore. In the space of one long night, four tiny bears had worked their way into their hearts, reminding them that even in the twilight of their careers, they could still make a difference. The real challenge, they knew, was just beginning, finding out who had separated these cubs from their mother and ensuring they survived to return to the wild where they belonged. But for now, watching Scout snuggle closer to his siblings, his fighting spirit restored, was enough. Sarah touched each cub gently, whispering their names like a prayer: Buddy, Charlie, Rocky, and Scout. In the growing light of dawn, their wet fur had dried to a soft black fluff, and their eyes, when open, showed more curiosity than fear. They had survived the night, but their journey was far from over. Dr. Emily Martinez stepped into the mud room, her experienced eyes immediately assessing the situation. The 4 bear cubs lay huddled together on the towel-covered bench, their tiny bodies no longer shaking with cold but still far from stable. She knelt beside them, her medical bag at the ready. "You've done an incredible job," she said, carefully examining Scout, the smallest cub. "Their body temperatures are nearly normal." Another hour in that storm, she left the sentence unfinished, but Sarah and Robert understood. They had come terrifyingly close to losing them all. Sarah hovered nearby, unable to step away from the cubs she'd spent the night protecting. "Scout gave us quite a scare," she explained, watching as Dr. Martinez gently checked his vital signs. "He stopped breathing twice during the night." The veterinarian nodded, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she examined each cub in turn. "They're about 3 weeks old," she confirmed, measuring Buddy's paw pads. "They should be denning with their mother. This isn't natural behavior. Bears are exceptional mothers." Robert leaned against the door frame, his face tight with concern. "Could they have been trafficked? We've had problems with wildlife smugglers in the region before." "It's possible," Dr. Martinez replied, preparing 4 small syringes of antibiotics. "But separating cubs this young is unusually cruel, even for traffickers. They're worth more when they're older." She administered the shots with gentle precision, each cub barely stirring under her touch. The morning light filtered through the mud room's small window, casting warm patches on the cub's black fur. Charlie, the gentlest of the 4, had begun to show interest in his surroundings, his dark eyes following their movements with growing awareness. Rocky remained true to his name, squirming and protesting whenever Dr. Martinez touched him. "They'll need round-the-clock care," the veterinarian explained, showing Sarah and Robert how to prepare the special formula. "They'll need feeding every 2 hours, including through the night. Their survival depends on it." Sarah nodded, already memorizing the feeding instructions. "We'll do whatever it takes." "But what about their future? They're too young to survive in the wild without their mother." Dr. Martinez's expression softened. "Right now, let's focus on keeping them alive. Once they're stronger, we can discuss rehabilitation options." She hesitated, looking at Scout, who had finally begun to show more energy. "They're going to need a lot of care before we reach that point." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Robert converted their spare room into a makeshift nursery, setting up heat lamps and creating a secure enclosure that would keep the cubs safe but allow them to move around as they gained strength. Sarah worked alongside Dr. Martinez, learning the intricate details of formula preparation and feeding techniques. "Hold the bottle at this angle," Dr. Martinez demonstrated, showing Sarah how to feed Scout without risking aspiration. "They're still learning to suckle properly." The tiny cub latched onto the specially designed bottle, his paws wrapping around it with surprising strength. Robert watched from the doorway, his heart warming at the sight. In all their years of wildlife rescue, he'd never seen Sarah so devoted to their charges. These cubs had awakened something in both of them, a fierce protective instinct that went beyond their professional duty. As the afternoon wore on, Dr. Martinez received an urgent call from another wildlife emergency. "I'll be back tomorrow to check on them," she promised, packing her medical supplies. "Call me immediately if anything changes. Remember, they're not out of danger yet." Left alone with their 4 tiny charges, Robert and Sarah settled into a routine. Every 2 hours, like clockwork, they prepared bottles of warm formula. Each cub had developed its own feeding style. Buddy, always the protector, would only eat after his siblings had started. Charlie was the most efficient, barely spilling a drop. Rocky lived up to his name by wrestling with the bottle, while Scout needed extra patience and encouragement. "Look at them," Sarah whispered during the evening feeding. "They're already so different from last night." The cubs had begun to show more personality, their movements stronger and more coordinated. Even Scout, though still the weakest, had started responding to their voices. Robert nodded, carefully cleaning Rocky after another energetic feeding session. "They're fighters, all of them." "But Sarah," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "we need to remember they're wild animals. We can't get too attached." Sarah met his eyes, understanding the warning but unable to completely accept it. "I know, Robert. But right now, we're all they have. We have to be more than just caretakers." As if in response to her words, Scout let out a tiny sound, not the desperate cry of the previous night, but a softer, almost contented noise. He snuggled closer to his siblings, his small body finally relaxed in true sleep. The night settled around their cabin, but unlike the previous evening's terror, this darkness brought a sense of purpose. Sarah and Robert took turns napping between feedings, neither willing to miss a moment of care. They'd seen too many rescued animals lose their fight to take anything for granted. During the midnight feeding, as moonlight painted silver streaks across the nursery floor, Sarah found herself humming softly to the cubs, an old lullaby her mother used to sing, its gentle melody seeming to soothe the tiny bears. Robert joined her, his deep voice harmonizing with hers in the quiet night. "We're going to find out who did this," he promised, watching the cubs drift back to sleep. "Someone knows something, and when we find them." Sarah touched his arm gently. "One battle at a time, love. Right now, these little ones need us to focus on them." She checked Scout's breathing one last time, relieved to feel its steady rhythm. "Tomorrow we can start asking questions. Tonight, we keep them safe." The cubs slept peacefully, their tiny bodies pressed together for warmth and comfort. In the soft glow of the heat lamp, they looked almost ordinary, just four baby bears dreaming whatever dreams young cubs might have. But Sarah and Robert knew better. These cubs represented something larger, a mystery to be solved, a wrong to be righted, and, most importantly, for precious lives to be saved. As the night deepened, their cabin became more than just a shelter. It transformed into a sanctuary of hope, where tiny hearts beat stronger with each passing hour and two dedicated souls stood guard against whatever darkness had threatened them. Morning broke over the Montana mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose gold. Sarah was preparing the cubs' first feeding of the day when a familiar truck pulled into their driveway. Dr. Martinez stepped out, this time accompanied by James Thompson, the region's leading wildlife expert. "We've got a situation," James announced as he entered, his usually cheerful face creased with concern. "Your rescued cubs have become quite the story. Local news picked it up last night." He held up his phone, showing them the headline, "Retired Rangers Save Mysteriously Abandoned Bear Cubs in Ice Storm." Robert's expression darkened. "We didn't contact any media." "How did they?" "Someone at the Wildlife Center must have tipped them off," Dr. Martinez interrupted, already moving toward the cubs. "But that's not necessarily bad news. We need all the help we can get." As if sensing the tension in the room, Scout let out a small whimper. Sarah immediately went to him, checking his temperature. "He's stronger today," she reported, relief evident in her voice. "They all are?" James watched the cubs with professional interest, taking notes on their behavior. Buddy had positioned himself protectively in front of his siblings again, while Charlie and Rocky played together, their movements more coordinated than the previous day. "They're doing remarkably well," he admitted. "But we need to talk about next steps." Before he could continue, Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Then Robert's. Then both their landlines started ringing. "The story's gone viral," James explained. "People want to help." The next few hours transformed their quiet cabin into an impromptu command center. Local community members began arriving with donations, formula, blankets, heating pads, and even a specialized incubator for Scout. Carol from the general store organized a supply chain, ensuring they'd have everything needed for round-the-clock care. "This is incredible," Sarah whispered to Robert as they watched another truck pull up, loaded with supplies. "People care," Robert replied, his voice thick with emotion. "They just need a reason to show it." Inside, Dr. Martinez was conducting another thorough examination of the cubs. "Scout's gained 2 ounces," she announced triumphantly. "He's not out of the woods yet, but it's a very good sign." The good news was interrupted by James clearing his throat. "We need to discuss something serious," he said, gathering everyone in the living room while Carol took over cub-sitting duties. "Based on where you found them and their age, I think I know what happened to these cubs." The room fell silent. James spread out a map on the coffee table, pointing to several marked locations. "There's been a series of reported den disturbances in the area. We thought it was just hikers getting too close, but now," he pulled out several photographs. "These are trail camera images from 3 weeks ago. They show a group of men carrying equipment typically used for drilling into dens." Sarah gasped. "They're poaching cubs during hibernation." "But why?" "Black market exotic pet trade," James said grimly. "There's been increasing demand for bear cubs as pets in certain countries. These monsters are tracking hibernating mothers and stealing their cubs. The mothers are usually tranquilized, and by the time they wake up..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Robert's ranger instincts kicked in full force. "We need to find these people. If they're hitting multiple dens..." "That's why I'm here," James interrupted. "The media attention on your cubs might help us catch them. People are already calling in tips about suspicious activity they've seen in the area. The wildlife authorities are setting up a task force." While they discussed strategy, Carol's voice called from the nursery. "Dr. Martinez. Something's happening with Scout." Everyone rushed to the room, fear gripping their hearts. But what they found wasn't what they expected. Scout, the tiniest of the cubs, was standing on wobbly legs for the first time, attempting to walk toward the formula bottle Carol had been preparing. "Well, would you look at that?" Dr. Martinez breathed, tears in her eyes. "He's not giving up without a fight." The moment seemed to energize everyone. Plans were made and tasks distributed. The local sheriff's office would coordinate with wildlife authorities, and community members would organize patrols of known den areas. The media attention, initially overwhelming, would be channeled into raising awareness and gathering tips. As the day progressed, more people arrived. A local construction company offered to build a proper rehabilitation enclosure behind the cabin, and a retired veterinary nurse volunteered to help with night feedings. Even the skeptical old-timers from the local diner showed up with casseroles and firm handshakes. "Your cubs have started something," James observed, watching the community mobilize. People are angry about what happened to them, but more than that, they're inspired by their resilience, by your dedication. Sarah, exhausted but happy, watched as Rocky and Charlie played with a soft toy someone had brought, their movements growing stronger by the hour. Buddy, ever the vigilant protector, showed signs of increasing trust, accepting treats directly from her hand. And Scout, their tiny miracle, managed to walk a full 3 steps before collapsing into a tired heap with his siblings. They're not just our cubs anymore, she realized aloud. They belong to everyone who's helping them survive. As evening approached and the stream of visitors finally slowed, Robert and Sarah found a quiet moment together. Through the nursery window, they could see the mountains where, somewhere, a mother bear had awakened to find her babies gone. But now, thanks to the cub's story touching so many hearts, there was hope that no other bear family would suffer the same fate. "We're going to find who did this," Robert said with quiet determination, "and we're going to make sure these little ones get a chance at the life they deserve." Sarah nodded, watching Scout snuggle between his siblings, no longer the fragile creature they'd found in the storm. "They've already changed so many lives," she said softly, "including ours." Outside, another vehicle pulled up, more volunteers arriving with supplies and support. The cubs' story had awakened something in their mountain community, a reminder that, in the face of cruelty, kindness could still prevail, and that even the smallest lives could inspire the biggest changes. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow, 4 tiny bears slept peacefully, unaware that their fight for survival had sparked a movement that would protect countless others like them in the future. The midnight wind whispered to the pine trees surrounding the cabin, carrying with it a profound sense of change. Inside the makeshift nursery, Sarah sat in her rocking chair, carefully feeding Scout's midnight formula. The smallest cub's transformation over the past week had been nothing short of miraculous, but tonight was different. Tonight was critical. "That's it, little one," Sarah murmured, watching Scout eagerly drain his bottle. "Show us your fighting spirit." Dr. Martinez's words from earlier that day echoed in her mind. The next 24 hours would determine if Scout could make a full recovery. Robert appeared in the doorway, his face etched with concern. "Any change?" "He's taking the formula better," Sarah replied, gently wiping Scout's mouth, "but his temperature is still higher than it should be." The infection they'd been battling had taken its toll on the tiny cub's body, and despite their best efforts, Scout's fever hadn't broken. In their cushioned enclosure, the other 3 cubs slept soundly. Buddy, ever the protector, had positioned himself closest to where Sarah sat with Scout. Charlie and Rocky were tangled together in a heap of black fur, their breathing deep and regular. They'd grown significantly stronger over the past week, but Scout's condition cast a shadow over their progress. The quiet night was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. Robert moved to the window, tension visible in his shoulders until he recognized the familiar trucks. "Wildlife Patrol's back," he announced. "And James is with them." Sarah carefully placed Scout back with his siblings, watching as Buddy immediately shifted to accommodate his smallest brother. Outside, car doors slammed, and multiple footsteps crunched through the snow toward their cabin. James Thompson entered first, followed by 2 state wildlife officers. Their expressions told Sarah everything she needed to know before they spoke. "No sign of the mother?" she asked quietly. James shook his head, removing his snow-covered hat. "We found the den," he said grimly. "Signs of drilling, just like we suspected. But there's more." He pulled out his tablet, showing them photographs of the crime scene. "They've hit 3 more dens in the past week." We're dealing with an organized operation. Robert's fists clenched at his sides. Any leads? Actually, yes, one of the wildlife officers stepped forward. Thanks to the media coverage of these cubs, we received dozens of tips. One of them led us to a supplier of specialized drilling equipment. He's willing to talk. Their discussion was interrupted by a soft whimper from the nursery. Sarah rushed back to find Scout trembling, his small body burning with fever. "Robert," she called, her voice tight with fear. "Get Dr. Martinez on the phone now." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Dr. Martinez arrived within 30 minutes, her face grave as she examined Scout. "The infection has spread," she explained, "and the tiny cub's fight for survival has entered its most critical phase. We'll start him on stronger antibiotics," she said, preparing an injection, "but he needs to fight this himself. We've done everything we can." Sarah refused to leave Scout's side, monitoring his breathing and temperature through the night. Robert brought her tea that grew cold, untouched, as she watched the smallest cub battle for his life. The other cubs seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, remaining unusually quiet and clustered near their ailing brother. As dawn approached, Scout's fever finally broke. His tiny body, which had been rigid with illness, relaxed into natural sleep. Sarah felt tears roll down her cheeks as she realized he had made it through the worst. "He's going to make it," Dr. Martinez confirmed during her morning check. "He's proven himself to be quite the fighter." The good news spread quickly through their now extensive network of supporters. By midday, the cabin's driveway was full of vehicles belonging to community members who had come to celebrate Scout's recovery and share updates on the investigation. James gathered everyone in the living room, his face animated with purpose. "The supplier talked," he announced. "He gave us names, locations, everything. The wildlife authorities are coordinating with federal agents. They're planning to move in on the poaching operation within the next 48 hours. The room erupted in excited murmurs, but Robert raised his hand for silence. "What about the other mothers? The other cubs?" James's expression sobered. "We've located 2 more dens that were hit. No cubs, but the mothers are alive. They're being monitored as for any other cubs." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "If they're still in the area, the raid should help us find them." Sarah listened from the nursery doorway, watching Scout attempt to play with his siblings. His movements were still weak, but there was a new energy in them, a promise of full recovery. Charlie kept nuzzling him encouragingly while Rocky tried to engage him in their usual roughhousing. Buddy, as always, supervised with watchful eyes. "They're getting too big for this space," Dr. Martinez observed, joining Sarah. "Once Scout's fully recovered, we'll need to think about their next step." Sarah nodded, her heart heavy with the knowledge that their time with the cubs was growing shorter. "The wildlife sanctuary near Yellowstone," she said softly, "they have experience with orphan cubs. Could they?" "I've already contacted them." Dr. Martinez smiled. "They're preparing a space. These little ones will have everything they need to grow into strong wild bears." The day wore on, filled with activity and purpose. The community's response to the cubs' plight had grown into a full-fledged wildlife protection movement. Plans were being made for regular den monitoring, community patrols, and educational programs about bear conservation. As evening settled over the mountains once more, Sarah and Robert found themselves alone with the cubs. Scout had managed to walk a full circle around the enclosure, his siblings staying close as if to catch him if he stumbled. Look at them, Robert said softly, wrapping an arm around Sarah's shoulders. A week ago, we thought we might lose them all. Now? Now they're teaching us about courage, Sarah finished, watching Scout attempt another wobbly step. And second chances. In the growing darkness, the four cubs curled together in their familiar sleeping position, Scout safely tucked between his brothers. Their steady breathing filled the room with a peaceful rhythm, a lullaby of survival and hope. Outside, the wind carried the promise of justice for their mother and the hope of protection for others like her. But inside the warm nursery, four tiny bears slept soundly, having won their most important battle, the fight to live, to grow, and to remind the world that every life, no matter how small, was worth saving. Dawn painted the Montana sky in brilliant shades of pink and gold, a fitting backdrop for the day the cubs would begin their new journey. The wildlife sanctuary's transport vehicles sat in the driveway of Robert and Sarah's cabin, its specialized equipment ready to carry four precious passengers to their new home. It's time, Robert said softly, watching Sarah make one final check of the cubs' traveling crates. In the 2 months since that stormy night, the cubs had transformed from helpless, shivering bundles into robust, playful bears. Even Scout, once so fragile, now wrestled with his brothers with impressive strength. The morning was filled with a flurry of last-minute preparations. Dr. Martinez arrived early to give the cubs a final health check, her eyes glistening with pride as she examined Scout. From barely breathing to this, she smiled, watching him bat playfully at her stethoscope. "You've done an amazing job with them." News cameras and local reporters gathered at a respectful distance, documenting this final chapter of a story that had captured hearts across the country. But more importantly, members of their mountain community had come to bid farewell to the cubs that had brought them all together. The raid was successful, James Thompson reported, joining Robert and Sarah as they prepared for the transfer. 17 arrests, 3 international trafficking rings broken up, and, he paused, his face breaking into a satisfied smile, we found 6 more cubs. They're already safe at other rehabilitation centers. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. 6 more? So something good really did come from all this? More than something, James replied. The publicity from your cub story led to new legislation, stricter penalties for den disturbance, increased funding for bear protection. You've changed things, all of you. The time for goodbyes came too quickly. Sarah knelt beside the enclosure where Buddy, Charlie, Rocky, and Scout played, unaware that their lives were about to change again. Remember that first night, she whispered to Robert. When we thought we might lose them? Robert squeezed her shoulder, his own eyes misty. Look at them now. Scout's almost as big as Buddy. One by one, they carefully guided the cubs into their transport crates. Buddy went first, maintaining his protective instincts until the end. Charlie followed quietly, accepting this new adventure with his usual gentle nature. Rocky lived up to his name, putting up a brief protest before settling down. Scout was last. He paused at the crate entrance, turning to look at Sarah and Robert with those bright, intelligent eyes that had captured their hearts that stormy night. For a moment, the tiny, struggling cub he'd been flashed through Sarah's memory, making her breath catch. Go, she whispered. Go on, little fighter. You've got a whole life of adventures ahead of you. As if understanding, Scout entered the crate calmly. The sanctuary staff secured the doors, checking each lock multiple times. Everything was done with the utmost care and professionalism, but it couldn't completely ease the ache in Sarah and Robert's hearts. They'll have everything they need at the sanctuary, Dr. Martinez assured them. 5 acres of natural habitat, minimal human contact, all the preparation they'll need for eventual release. The loading process went smoothly, each crate carefully secured in the climate-controlled transport. Before closing the final doors, the staff allowed Sarah and Robert one last look. All 4 cubs were alert, curious about their new surroundings but showing no signs of distress. The sanctuary will send regular updates, James promised. And you've been granted special permission to visit during their rehabilitation. After all, you're part of their story now. As the transport pulled away, Sarah felt Robert's arm around her shoulders. The gathered crowd began to disperse, but their closest supporters lingered, Dr. Martinez, James, and the community members who had become like family during this journey. What you've done here, James said, addressing the group, goes beyond saving 4 cubs. You've shown what's possible when people come together for something bigger than themselves. 1 year later, Sarah and Robert stood at the sanctuary's observation point, watching 4 young bears explore their spacious enclosure. Buddy still watched over his siblings, though they hardly needed protection anymore. Charlie had developed a talent for finding the best berries, while Rocky's adventurous spirit made him the first to try new experiences. And Scout, their tiny fighter, had grown into a strong, confident bear, showing no signs of his fragile beginning. If anything, his early struggles seemed to have given him a special resilience, a determination that showed in everything he did. Next spring, the sanctuary director told them they'll be ready for release. We've selected a remote area far from human activity but rich in natural food sources. They'll have everything they need to thrive. Sarah watched Scout successfully climb a tall tree, his movements sure and strong. They already have everything they need, she said softly. They have each other. As the sun began to set over the sanctuary, painting the sky in the same colors as that fateful morning over a year ago, Sarah and Robert prepared to leave. But before they did, they witnessed something remarkable. All 4 bears, now nearly grown, gathered together to sleep, just as they had as tiny cubs. Scout still nestled safely among his brothers. They remember, Robert said quietly. Some part of them remembers that night and how they survived it together. Sarah smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. And we'll remember too. Always. They drove home in comfortable silence, their hearts full. The cubs they had saved had grown into magnificent wild creatures, ready to live the lives they were meant to have. But more than that, they'd sparked a movement that would protect countless other bears, ensuring that fewer cubs would face the trauma of separation from their mothers. As they pulled into their driveway, Sarah looked at the mudroom where it had all begun. We did good, didn't we? She asked softly. Robert took her hand, squeezing it gently. We did better than good, love. We helped write a story of hope, and it's not over yet. Inside their cabin, a framed photograph hung on the wall, 4 tiny cubs huddled together on that first night, fighting for survival. Below it, a newer picture showed 4 strong, healthy bears, ready to face whatever adventures awaited them in the wild. And in that contrast lay the true miracle, not just of survival but of the endless possibilities that open up when people choose to care, to act, and to believe in second chances. The first shot rang out, shattering the silence. One of the men fired into the air, a warning meant to intimidate. But Eli didn't flinch. He took aim and fired back. The crack of his rifle echoed through the clearing. The bullet struck the ground near one of the men's horses, causing the animal to rear and throw its rider. Chaos erupted. Ember, sensing the danger, reared up, his powerful legs striking the air. One of the men tried to lasso the Mustang, but Ember lunged forward, breaking free of the rope. The horse charged toward the attackers, his hooves thundering against the ground. Eli fired another shot, this one grazing the shoulder of the leader. The man cursed, stumbling back as blood stained his shirt. The remaining riders hesitated, their confidence shaken by Ember's ferocity and Eli's precision, but the leader wasn't ready to give up. "Take him down," he shouted, his voice filled with rage. Eli retreated toward the cabin, using the structure as cover. He fired another shot, this one striking the leg of a man attempting to flank him. The attacker cried out, falling to the ground as his horse bolted into the forest. Rusty emerged from the shadows, barking fiercely as he darted toward the men, drawing their attention away from Eli. Ember's wild energy was the turning point. The Mustang charged at the leader, his hooves striking with terrifying force. The man raised his shotgun, but before he could fire, Ember reared up and knocked the weapon from his hands. The leader stumbled, his eyes wide with fear, as the Mustang stood over him, a living embodiment of the untamed wilderness. "Call them off," Eli shouted, his rifle trained on the remaining attackers, "or you won't walk out of here." The leader hesitated, his gaze shifting between Eli and Ember. Finally, he raised his hands in surrender. "Fall back," he yelled to his men. "It's not worth it." One by one, the attackers retreated, disappearing into the forest like shadows. Eli lowered his rifle, his chest heaving with adrenaline. Ember stood tall, his sides heaving, but his spirit unbroken. The Mustang snorted, tossing his head as if to say he'd known all along how it would end. As the clearing fell silent, Eli approached Ember, his hand resting on the horse's neck. "You did it, boy," he said softly. "You showed them what you're made of." The Mustang leaned into Eli's touch, his wild eyes softening. Together, they had faced the odds and come out stronger. The men wouldn't return, not after what they had seen. Eli knew that the wilderness had its own way of enforcing justice, and tonight it had been served. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Eli stood with Ember in the clearing, both of them battered but undefeated. They had fought not just for survival, but for freedom, and in doing so, they had forged a bond that nothing could break. The first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, illuminating the clearing where Ember stood tall and proud. His chestnut coat shimmered in the soft light, the scars on his legs a reminder of everything he had endured. Nearby, Eli leaned against the cabin's porch, his rifle resting by his side. For the first time in weeks, the air felt light, as if the forest itself was breathing a sigh of relief. The men who had come for Ember were gone, their arrogance shattered by the defiance of a Mustang and the resolve of a man who refused to back down. Eli knew they wouldn't return. The wilderness had taught them a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. Ember grazed quietly in the clearing, his ears flicking toward the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. The Mustang had been through hell, but he had emerged stronger, a testament to resilience and the unbreakable spirit of the wild. Eli watched him with a sense of pride and admiration. The horse had saved himself, but in doing so, he had also saved Eli. The cabin had always been a place of solitude, a refuge for a man who had chosen to live apart from the world. But Ember had changed that. The Mustang's presence had brought life back into Eli's days, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, there was still room for connection and hope. Eli walked to the edge of the clearing, where Ember lifted his head to meet his gaze. The horse's dark eyes were calm now, no longer clouded by fear. Eli reached out, placing a hand on Ember's neck. "You're something special, you know that," he said, his voice soft. "They tried to break you, but you didn't let them." Ember snorted, his breath puffing in the cool morning air. Eli chuckled, patting the Mustang's neck. "I think it's time," he said. "Time for you to go back to where you belong." Eli spent the next few hours preparing. He removed the makeshift halter from Ember's neck, running his hand along the horse's mane one last time. The Mustang stood still, as if understanding what was about to happen. Eli opened the gate to the clearing, stepping aside to let Ember see the path ahead. "You've earned it," Eli said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "Go on now, run free." For a moment, Ember didn't move. He looked at Eli, his dark eyes reflecting something unspoken, a bond that neither time nor distance could break. Then, with a powerful leap, he took off, his hooves thundering against the ground as he disappeared into the forest. Eli watched him go, a bittersweet smile on his face. The clearing felt emptier now, but it wasn't the same as before. Ember's presence had left a mark, a reminder that even in the deepest solitude, there was always the possibility of connection. Weeks turned into months, and the forest settled back into its familiar rhythm. The wolves returned to their distant hills, the men stayed far away, and Eli continued his quiet life in the cabin. But every so often, as he walked through the woods or sat on the porch, he would catch a glimpse of a chestnut figure moving through the trees. Ember was out there, free and wild, just as he was meant to be. And though he no longer lived in the clearing, Eli felt his presence as surely as if he were standing beside him. The wilderness had a way of testing those who called it home, but it also had a way of rewarding those who stood firm. For Eli and Ember, their story wasn't just one of survival. It was a testament to the power of resilience, trust, and the unbreakable bond between a man and the wild. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in a warm golden glow, Eli leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the tree line. Somewhere out there, Ember was running free, a symbol of everything the wilderness stood for: strength, freedom, and the enduring spirit of life. And for Eli, that was enough. Freedom is not just about survival, Eli mused. It's about reclaiming what was meant to be yours. This is the story of Ember, a Mustang who defied all odds, proving that courage and resilience can overcome even the cruelest of trials. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves inspiring stories of strength and connection. Together, we can spread a message of hope, compassion, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. Let's make sure no life is ever left behind.